A case for scientism. If people who do not know, in the philosophy of science there are many positions, right? And on the one extreme, usually within the realism and the anti-realism debate, on the one extreme of anti-realism, the farthest you could get is epistemological anarchism. Despite the name, it has nothing to do with the political philosophy of anarchism, where the philosophy basically is anything goes. Even by the founder of that philosophy, Paul Feyerabend, on a mission that includes racism, anti-Semitism, and scientific racism, and pseudoscience, and flat Earth and astrology. But for him, everything goes, everything's valid. Now, in the extreme other end of the realism, you have scientism, which is just scientific realism, but the difference between scientism and scientific realism specifically is about two things. One, about morals can be scientifically explained, and two, how to prove slash disprove the supernatural and the paranormal, stuff like that. For a scientific realist, usually do not talk about these things or trying to make a scientific case for it, while scientism does. I already made a video about that, about Ultra Plus, why science does not have limits, trying to make a case for scientism. But in this case, I want to make a second part dedicated to many consider the greatest philosopher in the history of Latin America, Mario Bunge, an Argentinian philosopher who basically started the whole scientific realism as a legitimate position right next to Hilary Putnam and to some extent Peter Kropotkin. So, to understand his last known writings talk about explicitly about the topic, although doesn't go in really in depth, but still is very important nonetheless. It was also well known that expertise in given scientific field is compatible with religious affiliation. For example, Christians can do excellent work in chemistry, though perhaps not in cognitive neuroscience, anthropology, or history. The belief in the superiority and the universal applicability of the scientific point of view is called scientism. If we can see this, for example, is for consciousness, let us start by remembering when it comes to several varieties. The various concepts of consciousness share the idea that such a spirit conscious mental event, whether she thinks of it. If a cognitive neuroscience perspective, a subject in a conscious, whatever one part of her brain monitor what goes on in another part of it. Scientism is not the same as reductionism, although it can be the case depending on your position. In particular, the intent to reduce wholes to their parts, micro-reductionism, or higher order entities, macro-reductionism. Both strategies have worked in few cases, but have failed in most. For example, the magnetism of an iron bar is explained as an amalgam of magnetic moments or spins of the individual iron atoms. When social psychologists have explained certain individual inclination or preferences in terms of the individual's position in social groups, such as classes or ethnicities, but have ignored key individual traits such as curiosity and creativity, whereas the fashionable rational choice theories, such as those of decision and game, have failed in attempting to account of large-scale social processes such as economic slumps and wars. Most reductionists attempt to have failures because they have ignored the emergence and submergence of property that accompany the agglomeration of individuals as well as a disintegration of wholes, as in freezing and liquefying, marriage and divorce, recruitment and demobilization. Family, firms, and armies have global properties that their components lack. Optics does not explain color because they occurs only in brains, which are very special living organisms, and the material entities, or its, are not bundles of bits or information theoretic units because the latter had no physical property and occur only when analyzing information process artifacts. In short, design and assessment of scientific research projects and their products should not ignore the existence on different levels of organization or microphysical, macrophysical, chemical, biological, microsocial, and macrosocial. This is known as multi-level ontology. The scientific stance is characterized by the modicum of philosophical awareness along with curiosity, disciplined imagination, cognitive argument in this search for pattern evidence, and moderate or partial skepticism. Is thus the opposite of dogmatism, in particular authoritarianism and radical skepticism, or the questioning of everything at the same time. A moderate skeptic will question item A on the strength of B, which in turn can only be questioned by assuming C, and so on. There is no suppositionalist inquiry, for the very statement of any problem takes some assumptions of or data for granted. For example, biologists take mathematics and chemistry for granted. Although philosophers are not competent to criticize particular physical findings, they are not able to spot the question some physical assumptions of physicists, such as operationist definition of time or whatever timepiece shown. In short, scientific skepticism is not total but partial and stepwise. Note that there are two kinds of modern skeptics, those who admit and those who reject the possibility that science may eventually tackle and solve certain problems. And if you take it to the extreme, like epistemological anarchism, there is no distinction at all what is true and what is false. Notably, those of the existence of God and of consciousness. The former are prepared to listen to arguments purporting to confute theism or to prove the occurrence of conscious and mental process. Since the belief in the supernatural is a belief among others, a scientific account of the formation and spread of belief should settle the question of religion's belief as so many human inventions. In fact, a branch of scientific psychology deals with belief, both grounded and groundless. In particular, religious beliefs are being studied scientifically, where any religious approach to science is bound to shake or distort it, for it admits the existence of a supernatural omniscient being who cannot fully conceive of. It is also well known the expertise in the given scientific field is compatible with religious affiliation. For example, Christians can do excellent work in other fields but not in others. Like I mentioned before, when you see the superiority of science, like scientism, like Wilfred Seller says, science it the ultimate knowledge of what is, what it is, and what is not. As for consciousness, let us start by admitting that it comes on several varieties to understand this. An electric network voltmeter, a car dashboard, and a STEM engine word regulator are similar, but of course radical skeptics like Noam Chomsky will repeat the old dogma that matter will always remain mysterious despite that being solved. And literally, if you go to read any field of neuroscience book or cognitive psychology, it's been proven that physicalism, that only the physical can have consciousness, specifically computationalism, also known computational theory of the mind, and functionalism, which is a subset of it, which, if those are false, the very existence of AI cannot even exist to begin with. So, just as the International Flat Earth Society keeps on meeting new members. Meanwhile, both conscious and unconscious mental processes are being successfully investigated by psychologists. The scientific stance is compatible with technological and philosophical viewpoints, to the point that sometimes it is indistinguishable from them, indicates experimental ethics and general systems theory. The scientific stance is likely to elicit the hostility of the humanistic or hermeneutic psychology and social students tied to the armchair, non-experimental, non-mathematical approach typical of literary studies such as Wittgensteinian pragmatism, who define the very possibility of social science. The scientific stance is particularly unpopular among the gatekeepers of the humanities. Thus, the philosophy editor for most prestigious American University Press state clearly his principle for submission that reject a mode of thinking that quantifies and commodifies the world around us to the exclusion of spiritual values. Presumably, he will reject any social study using the UN Human Development Index while buying speculation by armchair social students belonging to the Frankfurt School or critical theory, French structuralism or post-structuralism, or humanistics. The explicit and consistent adoption of scientific viewpoint is bound to affect numerous choices and decisions in all fields. For example, scientifically minded people will be skeptical about the alleged case of telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, ghosts, psychics, zombie, spoon bending at a distance, haunted homes, and the like. Some skeptics will try to produce them in a laboratory, explain why some people are more gullible than others, or even why people seem to need to believe in such a fantasy to begin with. For instance, in 2011, the psychology professor retired from Cornell University claimed that if properly trained, ordinary children can acquire precognition, that is, the paranormal activity of seeing the future. The pro-science debunker react immediately, holding that brains cannot feel effects before their cause is for. If they could be individuals, that ability would be able to act so as the effect the future, for instance, by preventing it from causing extraordinary phenomenon. The psychological community recently helped scorn on the otherwise reputable journal to publish a piece of precognition and found to strengthen the prevailing standards of scientific rigor. It is not to criticize the publishing errors. Gatekeepers should try and prevent serious error from being published by using scientific criteria, such as the scientifically minded person is neither neither not a lord nor a radical skeptic or know nothing. She seeks plausible answer to interesting question, trust only scrupple methods, and keep trying until hitting on what looks correct in the light of the extant knowledge, which may be correct by further research. In other words, she is a seeker, but not a seer, a fallibleist, but not defeatist. Further, she is not content with refuting errors, but hopes for new findings. While some findings of scientific research are final solution to some problems, others are approximate solution, and still others are unexpected new problems. Consequently, it is enriched of funds of knowledge such that it replaces the classical definition of knowledge as warrant true belief, with its description mixed bag of data and research approximating truths. Same features also guarantee that, far from being a closed system like the religion and political ideologies, especially on the right, scientific research is a self-sustained process with new challenges and thus new discovery adventures. This is the only guarantee one should expect from adopting the scientific stance. It will never cease to generate new jobs in the knowledge industry. In this book, I argue that scientific stance can be properly adopted in all the fields of inquiry and action, from physics to pharmacology to political science, policy design, and philosophy. This is the course of the scientific program, or what many people will call it, Scientism. 1. Language. The dictionary informs us that language is the method of human communication. By contrast, the grammarian Noam Chomsky has always contended that language is primarily a window of the soul in the instrument of thought, which as Jew views is true, or rather the truer. Whatever the dogmatists will accept one of them without further ado. The scientifically minded person is likely to ask for evidence in support of either thesis. Further, the skeptic may end up suggesting a third hypothesis, namely that A. the primary function of language is communication, suggested by personal experience as well as by social linguistic and primatological studies, and B. its secondary function is to help through processes, in particular the weighing of mutual inconsistent opinions and refinement of intuition or pre-analytic ideas. 2. Disease. On feeling sick, I consult a friend who offers a diagnosis and even a treatment as it works for her as well as for neighbor, but I am that more sophisticated. I consulted the Mayo Clinic Big Blue Book. Sure enough, I find that my symptoms find a certain disease, but a further search in the same volume suggests several other candidates. So I asked for a hospital appointment and get a diagnosis and a prescription. To make sure, I consult the medical literature to see whether the treatment I have been prescribed had passed randomized controlled trial. He has, but I have not feeling better. So I continue to search the literature until hitting on John Ioanni's pessimistic evaluation of the recent biomedical literature. Still, I do not give up because I am confident that someone somewhere is studying my problem in a scientific manner. The only game in town according to the scientific credo which I happen to profess. 3. Tropical forests. Carbon sinks or sources. Until recently, it is believed that forests are carbon sinks, whence the need to regulate logging. A recent study of satellite data about American, African, and Asian tropical forests gathered over 12 years have reserved the assessment tropical forests are a net carbon source. Consequently, the forest management policy as well as the emission reduction target had to be revised, but it would be foolish to regard the new result is a license to keep deforesting, since trees serve us many ways. In addition to participating in the carbon cycle, for example, they fix the soil and thus reduce landslides and are home to Aboriginal populations. 4. Rich/poor gap. The income inequality has been rising everywhere since around the 1960s, to the point that fabled American dream of going from rags to riches through hard work in free markets just a tad. A dream, because the only way to actually achieve a meaningful life will be anarcho-communism, because we will eliminate all forms of exploitation. And we can see a sample of the geographic location of Somia, which is the size of Europe with a population of 100 million people living in a pretty much an anarchist society, or in depending on location, anarcho-communist society. Or another sample of Zapatista Control Chiapas, Mexico, which is an anarcho-collectivist mutualist society, or Rojava, which is anarcho-communist, still transition some parts of it because they use the philosophy of reduction of communalism and libertarian municipalism, which they expanded the idea of democratic federalism. The different strategy have have been tried to cure this social ill. The mother of all social issues, according to Rousseau, one is government intervention to either mediate or side with one of the two parties, managers and workers. The other strategy is to use union power, that is collective bargaining, picketing and strike. Both methods have worked in some cases through decreasing frequency, either because of the insurgencies or because the union have been betrayed by their leaders, rejected by management, or even outlawed. Only 7% of American workforce is unionized, exactly one-tenth of the corresponding figure in Sweden, Denmark, and London. A scientific approach to the inequality issue might be concluded that conflict itself should be avoided by favoring the transformation of private firms into cooperatives, where workload compensation are discussed and determined democratically by the membership, unless the business is questioned either from family concern or a public utility, in which case it behooves the state to manage it and the public to find it through fair taxes. In short, the scientific approach, once broadly taught as the pinnacle of all economic issues, is currently under the attack by postmodern writers and self-styled library policymakers. Although that doesn't mean postmodernism is bullshit, it's just they get their ideas to such an extreme that basically shoot themselves in the foot sometimes, especially when it comes to like metaphysics ontology. For example, in the midst of severe epidemics or opioid prescription or dependency, some of the big pharmaceutical firms had discontinued research on non-addictive analgesics just because the sale of opium-based painkillers were profitable enough. Likewise, the denial of man-made global warming and the benefits of public education and healthcare ignored the scientific study of such issues in favor of vote-gaining improvisation of populist politicians. We are currently witnessing a quick return to the obscurantistic attitude that prevailed from the 1750 to 1950 period, when the West, the scientific stand prevailed over the antagonistic. Scientism, once proud and ruling in the Western culture, is now retreating in spite of its triumph in all fields but policies. The one area where ignorance can pass for wisdom, or depending who's in charge of the government, of course, selfishness for rationality, and the brutality for strong leadership. To sum up, the scientific stand has led to many victories in the struggle for enlightenment and welfare. However, let us face it, public trust in the stance has weakened in recent years in several advanced nations, where regressive ideology has replaced the research one, especially American fascism. Although the scientific history people have a misunderstanding people with great math theory, like the people's history of science, science has always been pragmatic and often supports scientists in many cases because it was the average person using physical evidence, empiricism, experimentation, and being fallible, and not some heroic genius who made up the entire philosophy by itself, like Galileo, Francis Bacon, or something like that. It was the everyday people putting empiricism and scientism into practice in everyday life to prove once and for all that it's the most effective form of knowledge there is. And because of that, when we lost that knowledge during the crisis of the third century, eventually the fall of Rome, where we have to go back to that type of knowledge until the scientific revolution, and even then it was until the 1960s when Karl Popper reintroduced fallibilism in the mainstream consensus of science, which has been introduced as far back as the second century, like Ptolemy, Galen, and Hero of Alexandria, and Sextus Empiricus, who were the true founders of the scientific method that we use today. But it was until the 1960s when we go back to what they started. The role of philosophy in the birth of modern science. Why was science not born in China, the most advanced society around the 1600s, when modern study emerged when the science emerged in Western Europe? Joseph Needham in 1954, the pioneering student in Chinese science technology, told us why. Because at the time, Chinese intellectual culture was dominated by three ideologies that were indifferent or even hostile to the study of nature, namely Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. Confucius had thought that matter was most is peaceful coexistence and law abiding. The Buddha that all is but transient appearance, and Lao Tzu that inner contemplation of religious pity trumped action. None of these sages encouraged people to explore the unknown, much less to improve the known. All three were incurious and passive, where scientists and technologists are immediate curious and adventurous. Something similar happened in Nahuatl or Aztec worldview. In Chu was speculative and socially conformist, when hence unfavorable to the emergence of science. True, Aztec astronomy was quite advanced, but it had narrow utilitarian goals, namely keeping the calendar for agriculture, plus astrology could see as a divination of personal affairs. The Aztec were not interested in seeking secular and disinterested knowledge of the universe. how and why modern science emerged in a few Western European countries around the 1600s, we do not yield yet for like pure certainty, right? Unless, yeah, with some exceptions like the rediscovery of the Greco-Roman writings of Galen, Ptolemy, Hero Alexandria, Pyrrhus, and Lucretius, when they were basically rediscovered. Over time, they revived the other theory, which was considered atheist philosophy at the time, and even back then. The fair Martin Mesmer is one of the craftsmen of the new mathematics and physics. We still lack a whole picture of the scientific revolution because each historian of science has adopted a sectoral approach, looking at only one of the many antecedents and progenitors of the scientific revolution: the Renaissance, the Reform, the exploration and looting of the New World, and the worldwide expansion of capitalism, the printing press, and the accompanying spread of literacy, and the new secular philosophy, and the effort on hand for geniuses working in the new problems of knowledge. From a systematic point of view, all of the above mentioned factors are important. That was decisive was the operated at the same time. However, my task is to present section is to focus on only one of them, the new philosophy, because there is no consensus of either it was or why it matters. The scientific revolution is usually understood as a set of unusual discoveries and inventions that started a new and fruitful tradition. I submit that this constructional amount of starting to end, since no scientific work can be started with the first adopting invention and approach, designing both a project to tackle a well-stated problem along with a strategy to carry it out, and a system of value to assess its result. For example, the apparent trivial problem of finding the exact shape of a hanging chair, the catenary, engaged from 1,000 scientists, among them Galileo, Huygens, Leibniz, and Euler during a full century. All those research projects include typical modern idealizations. In this case, modeling the real chain is a thin cable without links, and the final solution involves a mathematical function invented to solve the problem, namely the hyperbolic cosine. Even better, think of any other far bigger problem posed by the discovery of the America, such as the nature of its quote-unquote savages and their puzzling societies, like the Iroquois who had an anarchist society, and the Asian Pueblo people like the Sami and Hopi who had an anarchist society, and the Cuban Tainos and the Mapuche people also have an anarchist society, and to a lesser extent the Mosquito people of Central America, but that depending what tribe we're talking about. So yeah, and the Seminolese as well. It takes that the scientific revolution resulted from desacralizing the world, to use Max Weber's phrase, and wanting to inventory, understand, and master a purely secular term, with the sole help of recent experience. In sum, novelties generated by the scientific revolution constitute but a link in the following chain attached to the existing knowledge: approach, plan, research, result, replication, and evaluation. The official story is that new science was a byproduct of the rejection of Aristotelian scholasticism. I submit the authentic revolution of all kinds are not restricted to removing the old, they also build new scaffoldings. In the case of scientific breakthroughs, such as new scaffolding consists of original ways of posing and tackling epistemic problems, that is, new research strategy. For example, Copernicus fathered modern planetary astronomy when he replaced Ptolemy's studying individual planets with the investigation of solar system, but he kept a core true essential traits of Ptolemy's, his respect for observational data, and his use of mathematics, which remind us that Kuhn and Fiber notwithstanding, no revolution is total. In the succeeding century, Harvey and Vesalius encouraged modern human autonomy and physiology when they replaced the study of isolated organs with that of systems, such as the cardiovascular one. Newton was the first to view the universe as a system of bodies held together by gravitation. Quentin and Lontin separated by 2 century Earth facts by conceiving the market and national economy as systems, not just set of products. Trader and consumer, Faraday and Maxwell thought electrical charge and current together with magnets as systems kept together by electric and magnetic fields. Darwin could see a biospecies not as separate collective but as a branch of a tree of life. A system those components are bound by the descent relation, although it's more better instead of looking at it like a tree of life. Aaron Raw, who wrote the book The Foundational Fossils of Creationism, made a better comparison. It's like a bush, it's like all over the place, right? It's not just one root. It still has a root technically, but like it's not as pretty. It's like there's more diversity that people give credit for. Ron McConnell revolutionized neuroscience when the identified the units of nervous tissues and revealed the network or systems into which they combine. Rutherford and Bohr fought their modern atomic physics when they could see of the atom as a system of particles rather than a tiny marble. Bernardo Husserl was awarded the Nobel Prize for providing to the pancreas and the hypophysis, though rather distant from each other, belong to the induction system. Donald Hebb, inspired by the work that Cajal and his school renewed psychology and postulated that what feels, perceive, thinks, or evaluate are neither whole brains nor individual neurons, but something in between, cell assemblies or neural systems. And Keynes created modern microeconomics as well as socioeconomic policy that bears its name. Keynesianism, by treating the economy of a region as a social system closely connected to the political system rather than an amorphous aggregate of free agents. All of the above mentioned case, the innovation was centered on a material system rather than on either an isolated individual or an imperishable whole. Planets were no longer thought to be moved by angels. Neuronal systems were not deemed to be controlled by immaterial soul. Economics were not under the guidance of the invisible hand, and so on. In sum, makers of modern science tactfully practiced what I call systematic materialism, or alternative to crass materialism, or physicalism and dialectic materialism. The central thesis of this ontology of the very real entity where atom or cell, animal or society is a material system or component of such. This kind of materialism does not eliminate the mind. It's technically technically it's still physicalism, and technically speaking it's still reductive physicalism. It's just depending how you use the reductionism element of it when it comes to mind, right? Like computationalism and functionalism. It only records mental process as a brain process and consequently a subject to normal scientific investigation, nor does systematic materialism ignore or underrate the symbolic traits of culture. It just conceives of them as products of human living together on par with labor and social relations. However, let us get on with our story. I first suggest the scientific revolution consists to a larger extent in debating the free capital aspect of Aristotelianism, rationality, realism, and the conscious materialism of Theophrastus, Alexander Aphrodisia, Verres, and the Latin Verres. Indeed, the schoolmen respect logic, although, as Bacon and other critics know, they use it to dispute over the sacred scripture rather than explore the world, and except for the nominalists who were actually vulgar materialists. The schoolmen replaced nationalism with a moderate supernaturalism that did not interfere seriously with physics. For instance, Thomas Aquinas, in defiance of the established, promoted the study of Aristotelian physics, which kept no trace of supernaturalism. Moreover, the medieval theologians did not challenge the epistemological realism inherited from Greek antiquity. The challenge came only when Copernicus and his followers proposed the heliocentric model of the planetary system. Since this model contradicted the book of Genesis, Cardinal Bellarmino and other Catholic theologians came up with the ingenious trick, conventionalism or instrumentalism. According to the epistemology, the scientific theories are neither true nor false, but only the tools for making predictions. This was supposed to hold in particular for the heliocentric and geocentric models. Both were, at the time, compatible with the extant astronomical data, so the good empiricists had no reason to choose between them. In short, they were empirically equivalent models. Ironically, 3 centuries later, Philip Frank and other logical positivists resurrect this doctrine and thus tacitly approved the Inquisition's pivotal argument against Galileo. This episode illustrates the difference between realism and empiricism, was realism tend to account for reality, empiricists from Ptolemy to Bacon, Hume, Kant, Comte, Mach, Carnot, Rashomon, and Frank stuck to phenomena or appearances and thus anthropocentric, since there can be no appearance without subject. This holds for the social world as well for the physical one. The fact that most empiricists declared their love of science and had claimed to do scientific philosophy is besides the point. The point is that empiricism is inimical to science because it is subject-centered, where scientists strive to be as objective as possible, and scientific philosophers are expected to enrich realism. In summary, the progenitor of the scientific revolution practiced the rationality, naturalism, or even materialism and epistemological realism inherited from Greek antiquity, as well as the systematism that emerged along with modernity. Let us take a closer look at these philosophical ingredients of modern science: materialism, systematism, dynamicism, realism. The Phoenicians knew that religion and philosophical theory is good for business, particularly for foreign trade, the source of their great wealth. For this reason, They respect academic freedom at Padua University, which they founded and protected from the Inquisition. About 600, his most famous professor was Case Cremonini, a colleague, friend, and rival of Galileo. He was the most famous and best paid philosopher of his time, as well as a correspondent projector of several European prisons. Garomini, also a notorious heretic who Torquemada would have liked to burn at the stake, he was an outspoken materialist, realist, and rationalist, as well as Aristotle's faithful follower. Garomini was popular among the Padua students for denying the immortality of the soul and holding the recent triumph faith, which were Cremonini's contributions to the scientific revolution headed by his colleague Galileo and his former student William Harvey. None, except for the unfortunate role that Galileo assigned him in his soon-to-be condemned dialogue. In fact, Cremonini served as a model for Simplicio, one of the true schoolmen who refused to look at the sun and the moon from his telescope. Why bother looking at it if the philosopher had described it as perfect sphere, whereas Galileo claimed that the sun was spot, while the moon's surface was blemished by craters? Today's analog, the philosopher of mind who refused to look at covenant science, the vanguard of psychology. The moral of this episode that it is to engage scientific research other than routine work. Materialism, realism, and rationality are insufficient. That is, if not enough to deny the existence of disembodied spirits, to assert the reality and knowability of the external world, or to abide by reason rather than authority, revelation or intuition. To do good science is also necessary to adopt the scientific method. That is, to check one's conjecture against relevant data as well as the theories enjoying a good track record. In short, to respect for fertile theory and replicable evidence is necessary for doing good science. Nor is trust in the scientific stench enough to do grand science. A system approach, too, is required. That is, one must try to place the object inquiry in a context instead of isolating it from environment. For example, we underwater canon Hans Lee and the successor for we built the interscience that studied the supersystem constituted by the brain and the induction and immune system, namely psychoneural endocrine immunology. Further recent interdisciplines are culinary neuroscience, evolutionary development, biology, or even EvoDevo for short. Similar functions have emerged into social science in recent years, such as socioeconomics and political sociology. All of the above mentioned fusion and some affected 1 century after the birth of physical chemistry or chemical physics. Biochemistry, biophysics, and social medicine like social hygiene. In sum, he has become increasingly clear that all the disciplinary barriers are largely artificial because the universe is a system of all systems. It is fundamentally just the physical. The methodological concept where the specialization of disciplinary division process must be balanced by parallels of process of progressive fusion from trunks to branches and vice versa. We meet systems where we look for them. In physics, we study the system from atom to galaxy. In chemistry, from molecular to system of chemical reaction. In social science, from family to international organization. And in engineering, from nuts and bolts couple to jet engine, with a concrete entity, so with abstract ones such as groups. Space systems of equation and hypothesis of this system. An explicit systematic view will help us to the interdependence beneath a collective of isolated items, and thus individual item is a member of a whole constructed in some regards and expanded its reach in others. Suffice it to contrast the unemployed homeless with the employed family man. Systemism entails dynamicism or process ontology because every interaction causes change, both internal and external. That dynamicism is contrary to Platonic worldview, according to which the basic constituted world are immutable, disembodied and eternal ideas. Ironically, Plato, an objective idealist, gave the correct definition of material as a changeable or corruptible in his hierarchic worldview, and any materialist who admit the identity of material with changeability will be a dynamicist. In particular, biologists would take evolutionary terms, anthropologists in terms of biosocial evolution, and historians in terms of interacting in various social groups such as bands, nations, and blocks. A dynamicist ontology will favor sketch for laws and change as well as for mechanism of complex states. That is, their characteristic process such as reproduction work and trade in the case of human groups. It is no accident that Machiavelli, the founder of modern political science, explicitly criticized Plato's thesis that whatever change is imperfect. Machiavelli saw society in constant change, nor is accidental that Galileo saw sought the laws of motion, both experimental and mathematical, instead of repeating the belief of his predecessors. Since then, the kernel of any advanced scientific theory is to set the equation of change. Since then, true nearly all scientists expect today's best theories will eventually be perfected or replaced. Only unconstruction Marxists, orthodox economists, and arrogant physicists believe that their own theories, or at worst, the next one, will be the final one. Scientists involve both moderate skepticism about current knowledge and mellorism, or trust the future research is bound to produce new and more accurate or deeper knowledge, impossible according to extreme skepticism. Scientism and humanism. To innovate in the yawn or self-science, it is adventurous to adopt scientism. This is a methodological thesis, the best way of exploring reality to adopt the scientific method, which way boiled down to the rule check your guesses. Scientists has been explicitly opposed by dogmatists and obscurantists of all stripes, such as religious people, neoliberal ideology, Friedrich von Hayek, and critical theorists like Jürgen Habermas, who managed to amalgamate Hegel, Marx, and Freud, and trying to shift and focus social science from work, mutual help, and struggle to communicative action, that is talk. Landersofer vocabulary gave the following definition of scientism: it is the idea that the spirit and the method of science ought to be extended to all the domain of intellectual, moral, social life without exception. Thus, contrary to the detractors, science is not the same as social naturalism or the attempt to ape the natural science in social domain. It is only an attempt to use scientific method in dealing with the problems concerning facts. Scientism is opposed to irrationalism, particularly intuitionism and mysterialism. The claim that there are mysteries such as nature, matter, and mind that science will never solve, like Chomsky. But also those who try to pass off their groundless speculation for scientific findings reject scientism. That is the case with selfish gene idea, memetics, psychological nativism, and speculative evolutionary psychology, who attempt to explain everything social in exclusive biological terms, thus overlooking the fact there are social interventions, and some of these, such as welfare or some kinship rule of Stein societies, are detrimental to life, and other elements like chemistry and physics also are involved. Obviously, scientism is necessary but insufficient for scientific progress. Indeed, the scientific method may be useful to handle uninteresting or even ridiculous problems, that is, problems with trivial solution, or that ignores well-known pieces of knowledge. That is the case with the publication in scientific journal that earned the Ig Nobel Prize Award yearly to 10 ridiculous papers. The following are among the findings that deserved the prize award in 2008. Dog fleas jump higher than cat fleas. Armadillo may distort the content of archaeological sites. The more expensive placebo are also the most effective. Hair tend to get tangled, and plants have dignity. As Moeller said, a learned fool is more foolish than an ignorant one. Last but not least, scientific progress also requires observation. The moral norms are regular and the research of truth. This has become scientific research a social endeavor, since it involves cooperating in some respect while competing in others. In fact, even the most reclusive or investigator utilize findings of others and in turn feeds for readers intellectually. And to avoid purely constructed conflict, all such a transaction must follow the norm of coexistence, which are moral norms. For example, plagiarism is more strongly condemned in science than in humanities because teamwork is more common in the former than in the latter. In a classical article, the founder of scientific sociology of science showed that basic research is ruled by following normative norms: intellectual honesty, integrity, organized skepticism, disinterest, confident communism, and impersonality. I will add only a few more: cooperating with peers and students rather than exploiting them, combining research with teaching, promoting the free and fair competition for grants, students, and jobs, tackling issues whose research may annoy the powers that be, telling the truth even if needed, particularly if contradicts the ruling worldview, popularizing science and scientism, denounce pseudoscience and obscurantism, abstaining from using science to harm people, the ultimate goal of research funded by armed forces. By the way, let us not blame scientists for the military use of their findings, because weapons are designed by engineers and manufactured by factories managed by businessmen and military leaders, who sometimes work in cahoots with criminal politicians. For instance, Einstein did not design a nuclear bomb that President Truman ordered to be launched on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but to his credit, eventually Einstein repented his tiny if decisive part in the heinous crime and did not tire of repeating the basic scientist search for truth: no riches or political power. Al Capone's Mama Teresa did not begin monster, but little our teacher cannot be left off lightly. The philosophical pentagons, regular and irregular. The upshot of the proceeding is that the search for new and important truth about reality is more or less explicitly committed to philosophical pentagon made up of rationalism, realism, materialism, systemism, and humanism. I submit that Galileo and his disciples, were Kepler, Harvey, Hughes, Boyle, and other founders of modern science, adopted the philosophical pentagon in a tactic way. Descartes only missed realism, saying he never bothered to look for empirical evidence for his fantasy about the ambiguous worlds. Much closer to us, we find at least 5 great scientists who adopt the pentagon and change dominant worldviews: Darwin, Cahol, Rutherford, Einstein, and Keynes. And although I will add Peter McGurkin to his contribution on how evolution behavior works when nature functions under mutualism and cooperation. For natural scientists and one social scientist, however, it may be argued that Martin Close, who will qualify here not before residual Hegelianism, his love for prophecy. Why that asymmetry between social and natural scientists? It cannot be a matter of age, because social science started with historiography and paleology are just as old as the natural ones. It could be instead because telling the truth about social issues takes more objectivity, independence, civil courage than telling about nature, or might be also due to the fact that many students of society were strongly influenced by philosophers like Kant, Dutoy, Rucker, Bergson, Hustler, Kadame, Ricord, Habermas, Putman, and Taylor denied the possibility of understanding society through scientific method. This is such a different investigations. In most cases, the sites of our philosophical pentagon are not equal. Sometimes materialism is short, other cases realism is sufficient, and still other humanism is weak. For example, until a century ago, many biologists were vitalists. Many students of society succumbed to Kantian subjectivism, and most 19th century physicists opposed to the atomic hypothesis proposed by chemists. Even today, one may find nativist psychologists and social students who prefer humanitarian speculation to the scientific method. Paradoxically, nearly all of the founders of microphysics, in particular Bohr, Heisenberg, and Bohr, preached positivism, while investigating and dating the fathers of modern positivism from Comte to Mach had declared non-existent. In fact, those scientific giants denied the autonomous or objective existence of the very object they studied so successfully, namely atoms and their components that extolled subjectivism and phenomenalism. But of course, those eminent physicists did not practice the philosophy that they extolled. They did not include the observed into their best set equation, and they admit the reality check performs in physics lab. In this case, a bad philosophy did not frustrate the ancient atomic project of explaining the visible by the invisible. Likewise, Newton praised inductivism in the same book in his monumental Principia, where he expounded the earliest fruit of hypothetical deductive method in natural science. It is voluntary depictions like these that impel Einstein to warn us that to find out what scientists really think about science, one should look at what they do, not what they say they do. Something similar happened to social science. Karl Marx conducted original and important scientific research while praising Hegel's anti-scientific philosophy. As Traeger showed, a number of Marxists made original contributions to archaeology thanks to their materialist system and scientific approach, such as has been said by some Marxist historians. After all, the past barks but does not bite, unless it is sometimes the worst logical sin, namely inconsistency, pays. It does whatever the truth is unwillingly assert together with its denial, where technological advances pray for facilitating daily life while deploying the unemployment it generates. The skeptical eye. It is not enough to promote and conduct rigorous research, it is also necessary to protect it from pseudoscience, which sometimes infect the scientific community. True example must suffice here: nativism, or the myth of innate ideas, and economic orthodoxy, or the myth of the rational utilizing, maximizing consumer and self-correcting market, which is the current, neoclassical noobs slash post-Keynesianism of the economy that we have today when it comes to capitalism. Natalism is the thesis that we're born knowing a lot, which suggests that its upholders knew gave baby tests of any school subject. The ideological political consequences are obvious. Neither education nor social reform can correct social inequality. Steven Pinker, the most popular psychologist of his day, stated that a new science of human nature, from genetic to evolutionary psychology, vindicate what he called the tragic vision. This is not other than ferocious individualism of orthodox economic and conservative political philosophy. Despite Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence is Beyond Decline, when when he gives all the credits of anarchists, communists, socialists, he gives credit to capitalists of something what anarchists did. And when you look what society he wants, even though he says he wants neoliberal capitalism, but if you read carefully what type of society he actually wants is social democracy. So he's being disingenuous. In particular, the following discoveries of these new science, the primacy of family ties, despite the obvious fact that in most cases the member business first political cliques, laboratories, regiments, and sports teams are genetically unrelated, the universality of dominance and violence across human society, even though the murder has been declining all civilized society over the past century, that not even the most divided society are basically tyrannical and violent, and the universality of ethnocentrism and other forms of group against group hostility across society. As such, undeniable traits are not moderated by tolerance, law-abiding, and cooperation, the limited scope of communal sharing and groups. Although social archaeology found long ago that social stratification emerged only about 5 millennia ago, along with the state, and the primitive wave foragers and scavengers rather than mighty hunters. Pinker's list of accomplishments of the new science of human nature reads like a prelude to the new right manifesto rather than a summary of scientific findings. Much the same applies to self-styled evolutionary psychologists who expose nativism either with regard to social stratification and welfare and enjoys Pinker's enthusiastic support. Our second example is the ruling economic orthodoxy, the free that by most economic professors who never foresaw any economic crisis, despite the fact there's like an economic crisis every 5 years, every 40 years. And like I said, the capitalism was first introduced at the earliest example of the 9th century, started by the Islamic slave trade, and when the accumulation of capital see example by Muslim scholars in the 15th century. And we see people who predate the 9th century or around the same time has similar capitalist ideas but never put into practice, like Venetianism in China, ancient China, and the Jains, who were a mercantile class in India, and early capitalism in the were early banks and stuff from the 10th century up to the 16th century. In conclusion, philosophical proclaim credible scientific research, as Shakespeare might call it, may be either a nest which to lay and brood promising ideas, or a cage to prevent the flight of imagination. In other words, a philosophy may be progressive or reactionary, accordingly, and facility obstruct the advantage of knowledge. I suggest that whoever does any productive scientific work practice a physicalist scientism philosophy. And natural scientists have been doing this tactically for half a millennia, so have nothing to fear from postmodern fashion or people who are anti-science in general, which is nothing but update of the counter-enlightenment born from the 1800s. In contrast, the student of society humanities are not immunized against the fashion. What can be expected from students who take seriously the spiritualist, the subjectivist, the anti-systematic philosophy that Max Weber and Prentice preach but not always practice, where the phenomenologists of Scrooge and the anthropologist who progress both practice and preach? For one thing, such a student will not bother to find out how people make a living, and for 40, she should not care for social statistics. This is because being a spiritualist, she will be interested exclusively in ideas, pictures, games, and religious ceremonies for the same reason. She will be unable to understand expeditions or wars, since nearly all of these are motivated by desire to get hold of natural human resources. Nor will be she understood the current economic crisis as one of its causes is the fight to big corporations and the political helpers against all the regular aiming of restricting the power over individuals, and being anti-humanist, such as a student who refused to acknowledge that most successful nations are those who welfare still prevails, lacking in the true social theories and humanist morality, are all victims of pseudoscience who favor means and social economic policy that in the end will worsen the crisis of the old-fashioned capitalism that is currently in global crisis and threatens to open society, as George Soros warned a decade ago. In summary, all scientific research concluded aside in social frameworks and a philosophical matrix. If the social framework is broad and flexible, it is encouraged innovation. It will protect the people who are more motivated by curiosity and peer recognition rather than profit and social prestige. And if the underlying philosophy is rationalist, materialist, systemist, realist, and humanist, this interest research may bear fruit otherwise, likely the product that produce pseudoscience garbage. Consequently, those in charge of design cultural policy will do well to protect the philosophical pentagon. This is the reason that why scientism and ontologically speaking, physicalism is true.